The park paling was still the boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. After walking 2 or 3 miles along that part of the lane, she was tempted by the pleasantness of the morning to stop at the gate and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passing count had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and fearful of its being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating, but the person who advanced was now near enough to see her, and stepping forward with eagerness pronounced her name. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called so in a voice which proved it to be Mr. Darcy, she moved again towards the gate. He had by the time reached it also, and holding out a letter which she instinctively took, said with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking as a groom some time in the hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honour of reading the letter?" And then with a slight bow turned again into the plantation and was soon out of sight. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and to her still increasing wonder perceived an envelope uh, "Hi, Mirza, how are you?" containing 2 sheets of letter paper. When quite through in a very close hand, the envelope itself was likewise full. Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows: "Be not alarmed on receiving this letter by the apprehension of its containing any repetition of those sentiments of renewal of those offers, which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of painting you or humbling myself by dwelling on wishes which for the happiness of both cannot be too soon forgotten, and the effort which the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion should have been spared had not my character required it to be written and read. You must before pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings I know will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice." Thank you very much for coming back to my live streams. I really appreciate it. So if you have 2 minutes, I just want to wish you to have a great day. Thank you very much, Mirza, one more time. It's really nice to meet you in each and every live stream of mine. Have a nice day there. Wish you everything the best. Whenever you will have the time, come back with our live, okay? So then I'll continue reading. "Two offences of a very different nature, and by no means of equal magnitude, you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defence of honour and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham, wilfully and wantonly to have thrown off companion of my yes." And you have a good day. Thank you very much, my dear. I appreciate that. Mm. My father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence on our patronage, and who had been brought to brought up to expect its exertion would be the privilege to which the separation of two young persons whose affection could be growth of only a few weeks could bear no comparison, but from the severity of the blame which was last night so liberally bestowed respecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in future secured when the following account of my actions and their motives had been written, if in explanation of than which is due to myself. I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours. I can only say that I'm sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and further apology would be absurd. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your eldest sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not only is the evening of the dance of Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feeling a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At the ball where I had the honour of dancing with you, I was first made acquainted by Sir William Lucas. Accidental information that Bingley's attentions to your sister had given rise to a general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event of which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could then perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister, I also watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, and engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard, and remained convinced from the evening scrutiny that though she received his attentions with pleasure, and she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. If you have not been mistaken here, I must be in an error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such a word to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that the serenity of your sister's countenance and air was such as might have given the most acute observer a conviction that, however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely to be easily touched, that I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigations and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes or fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as truly as I wished it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which I last night acknowledged to know requires the utmost force of passion, but aside in my own case, the want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me. But there were other causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing, and existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavoured to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison of the total want of propriety, so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your three younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations, and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that you have conducted yourself so as to avoid any share of the like censure. It praise no less generally bestowed on you and your eldest sister, that it is honorable to the sense and disposition of both. I will only say further that from what passed the evening, my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. Her sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother. We shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friends the certain evils of such choice. I described and enforced them earnestly, but however this remonstrance might have struggled or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage. It had not been seconded by the assurance which I hesitated not in giving of your sister's indifference. He had before of her to return his affection with sincere, if not with equal regard. But Bingley has great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was no very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. This is but one part of my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I considered uh, to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. I knew it myself as it was known to Miss Bingley, but the brother is even yet ignorant of it. That they might have met without ill consequence, it perhaps probable, but his regard did not appeared to me enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, his disguise, was beneath me. It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject, I have nothing more to say. No other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which govern me may to your very nature appear insufficient, I have not yet learned to condemn them. With respect to that other more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me, I am ignorant, but of the truth of what I shall relate, I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man who had for many years in the management of all the Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him. And on George Wickham, who was his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge, most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. My father was not only fond of his young man's society, whose manners were always engaging, he had also the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments which Mr. Darcy could not have. Here again I shall give you pain. To what degree you only can tell. But whatever may be the sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be his. As soon as it became vacant, there was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these years, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage in lieu of the preferment by which he could not be benefited. He had some intention, he added, of studying the law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to existence in the church, where it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite to Pemberley or admit his society in town. Um, I believe he chiefly lived, but his studying in the law was a more pretense, and being um, now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the decease of the incumbent of the uh, living which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for presentation. His circumstances, he assured me, and I had no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law as most of profitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained. If I would present him to the living, in question of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as he was well assured that I had no other person to provide for, and I could not have forgotten my revered father's intentions. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or for resisting a repetition of it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to human being. Having said thus much, I have no doubt of secrecy. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago she was taken from school, and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer he went with lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also met Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly he designed by design, for they proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Miss Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived, and by her convenience and aid he so far recommended himself to Georgiana, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and not to consent and to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse, and after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the marriage of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or oh my God, okay, before the okay, day or two before the intended elopement, and Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving of offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as the father acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was, of course, removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionable my sister's fortune, which is £30,000, but I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been completed in this Madame is faithful narrative of every event on in which we have been concerned to together, and if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit my henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he has imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at, ignorant as you previously were of every time concerning either. The detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told you last night, but I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more particular to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who, from our near relationship and constant intimacy, and still more as one of the executors of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. If your abhorrence of me should make me exercise valueless, you can now be not be prevented by the same cause from confiding in my cousin, and that there may be the possibility of consulting him. I shall endeavour to find some opportunity of putting this letter into your hands in this course of the morning. I will only add, God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Chapter 13. Elizabeth, when Mr. Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his offers. She had formed no expectation at all of its contents, but such as they were, it may be well supposed how eagerly she went through them, and what a contrariety of emotions they excited. Her feelings as she read were scarcely to be defined. With amazement did she first understand that he believed any apology to be in his power, and steadfastly was she persuaded that he could have no explanation to give which a just sense of shame would not. Oh my god, I lost it. Okay, it's here. With a strong prejudice against everything he might say. She began his account of what had happened at Netherfield. She read with an eagerness which hardly left her power of comprehension, and from impatience of knowing what the next sentence might bring, was incapable of attending to the sense of the one before her eyes. His belief of her sister's insensibility she instantly resolved to be false, and his account of the real. The worst objections to the match made her too angry to have any wish of doing him justice. He expressed the weakness for working her, which satisfied her. His style was not penitent, but haughtily. haughtily. It was all pride and insolence. But when the subject was succeeded by his account of Mr. Wickham, when she read with somewhat clearer attention a relation of events which, if true, must overthrow every cherished opinion of his worth, and which bore so alarming an affinity to his own history of himself, her feelings were yet more acutely painful and more difficult of definition. Astonishment, apprehension, and ever horror oppressed her. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false, this cannot be, this must be gross falsehood." And when she had gone through the whole letter, though scarcely knowing anything of the last page or two, put it hastily away, protesting that she would not regard it, that she would never look in it again. In this perturbed state of mind, with thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on, but it would not do. In half a minute the letter was unfolded again, and collecting herself as well as she could, she again began the mortifying perusal of all that related to Wickham, and commanded herself so far as to examine the meaning of every sentence. The account of The account of his connection with the Pemberley family was exactly what he had related himself, and the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, though she had not before known its extent, agreed equally well with his own words. So far, each recital confirmed the other, but when she came to wills, the difference was great. What Wickham had said of the living was fresh in her memory, and as she recalled his very words, it was impossible not to feel that there was gross duplicity on one side or other, and for a few moments she flattered herself that her wishes did not err. But when she read and reread with the closest attention the particulars immediately following of Wickham's resigning all pretensions to the living, of his receiving in lieu so considerable a sum as £3,000 again was she forced to hesitate. She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance with what she meant to be impartially deliberated on the probability of each sentence, but with little success. On both sides it was only assertion. Again she read on, but every line proved more clearly that the affair which she had believed it impossible that any contrivance could so represent as to render Mr. Darcy's conduct in it less than infamous, was capable of a turn which must make him entirely blameless throughout the whole. The extravagance and general profligacy which he scrupled not to lay to Mr. Wickham's charge exceedingly shocked her, the more so as she could bring no proof of its injustice. She had never heard of him before his entrance into the uh, shire militia, in which he had engaged at the persuasion of the young man who on meeting had accidentally in town had there renewed a slight acquaintance of his former way of life. Nothing had been known in Hertfordshire but what he told himself as to his real character, and information being in her power, she had never felt a wish of inquiry. His countenance, voice, and manner has established him at once in the possession of every virtue. She tried to recollect some instance of goodness, some distinguished trait of integrity or benevolence that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least, by the predominance of virtue, atone for those casual errors under which you would endeavour to class what Mr. Darcy had described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. But no such recollection befriended her. She could see him instantly before her, in every charm of air and address, but she could remember no more substantial good than the general approbation of the neighbourhood, and the regard which his social powers had gained him in the mass. After pausing on this point of considerable while, she once more continued to read. But alas! The story which followed of his designs on Miss Darcy received some confirmation from what had passed between Colonel and herself only the morning before, and at last she was referred for the truth of every particular to Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, from whom she had previously received the information of his near concern in all his cousin's affairs, and whose character she had no reason to question. At one time she had almost resolved on applying to him, but the idea was checked by the awkwardness of the application, and at length wholly banished by the conviction that Mr. Darcy would never have hazarded such a proposal if he had not been well assured of his cousin's corroboration. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in conversation between Wickham and herself. In their first evening at Mr. Philip's, many of his expressions were still fresh in her memory. She was now struck with the impropriety of such communications to a stranger, and wondered it had escaped her before. She saw the indelicacy of putting himself forward as he had done, and the inconsistency of his professions with his conduct. She remembered that he had boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, that Mr. Darcy might leave the country, but that he should stand his ground. Yet he had avoided the Netherfield ball with very next week. She remembered also that till the Netherfield family had quitted the country, he had told his story to no one but herself, but that after their removal it had been everywhere discussed, that he had been no reserves, no scruples in sinking Mr. Darcy's character, though he had assured her that respect of the father would always prevent his exposing the son. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned. His attentions to Miss King were now the consequence of views solely and hatefully mercenary, and the mediocrity of her fortune proved no longer the moderation of his wishes, but his eagerness to grasp at anything. His behavior to herself could now have not tolerable motive. He had either been deceived with regard to her fortune, or had been gratifying his vanity by encouraging the preference which he believed she had most incautiously shewn. Every lingering struggle in his favour grew fainter and fainter, and in further justification of Mr. Darcy she could not but allow that Mr. Bingley, when questioned by Jane, had long ago asserted his blamelessness in the affair, that proud and repulsive as were his manners, she had never in the whole course of their acquaintance, an acquaintance which had latterly brought them much together and given her a sort of intimacy with his ways, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust, and anything that spoke him of irreligious or immoral habits, that among his own connection he was esteemed and valued, that even Wickham had allowed him merit as a brother, and that she had often heard him speak of affectionately of his sister as to prove him capable of some amiable feelings, that had his actions been what Wickham represented them, so gross a violation of everything right could hardly have been concealed from the world, and that friendship between a person capable of it and such an amiable man, Mr. Bingley, was incomprehensible. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself, or of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think, without feeling that she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. How despicably, despicably have I acted, she cried. I who have prided myself on my discernment, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind, but vanity, not love, has been my folly, pleased with the preference of one, and offended by the neglect of the other. From the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself. From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in a line which soon brought to her recollection that Mr. Darcy's explanation there had appeared a very insufficient, and she read it again. Widely different was the effect of a second perusal. How could she deny that credit or to his assertions in one instance which she had been obliged to give in the other? He declared himself to have been totally unsuspicious of her sister's attachment, and she could not help remembering what Charlotte's opinion had always been, neither could she deny the justice of his description of Jane. She felt that Jane's feelings, though fervent, were little displayed, and that there was a constant complacency in her air and manner, not often united with great sensibility. When she came to the part of the letter in which her family were mentioned in terms of such mortifying yet merit reproached, her sense of shame was severe. The justice of the courage struck her too forcibly for denial, and the circumstances to which he particularly alluded, as having passed at the Netherfield ball, and as confirming all his first probation could not have made a stronger impression on his mind than on hers. She compliment to herself and her sister was not unfelt. It soothed, but it could not console her for the contempt which had been thus self-attracted by the rest of her family, and as she considered that Jane's disappointment had in fact been the work of her nearest relations, and reflected how materially the work of her materially the credit of both must be hurt by such impropriety of conduct, she felt depressed beyond anything she had and ever known before. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to every variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and reconciling herself as well as she could to a change so sudden and so important. Fatigue and the recollection of her absence made her at length return home, and she entered the house with wish of appearing cheerful as usual, and the resolution of repressing such reflections as must make her unfit for conversation. She was immediately told that the two gentlemen from Rosings had each called during her absence, Mr. Darcy only for a few minutes to take leave, but the Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them at least an hour, hoping for her return, and almost resolved to walk after her till she could be found. Elizabeth could but just affect concerning missing him. She really rejoiced that it Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer an object. She could think only of her letter. The two gentlemen left Rosings the next morning, and Mr. Collins, having been in waiting near the woods to make them his parting obeisance, was able to bring home the pleasing intelligence of their appearing in very good health and in as tolerable spirits as could be expected after the melancholy sands so lately gone through at Rosings. To Rosings he then hastened to console Lady Catherine and her daughter, and his return brought back with great satisfaction a message from her ladyship reporting that she felt herself so dull as to make her very desirous of having them all to dine with her. Elizabeth could not see Lady Catherine without recollecting that had she chosen it, she might by this time have been presented to her as her future niece, nor could she think without a smile or what her ladyship's indignation would have been. What would she have said? How would she have behaved? Were questions which she amused herself. Their first subject was the diminution of the Rosings party. I assure you I feel it exceedingly, said Lady Catherine. I believe nobody feels the loss of friends so much as I do. But I am particularly attached to this young man, and now them to be so much attached to me. They were excessively sorry to go, but so they always are. The dear Colonel relied his spirits tolerably till just at last, but Darcy seemed to feel it most acutely, more I think than last year. His attachment to Rosing certainly increases. Mr. Collins had an compliment and an illusion to throw in here, which they were kindly smiled on by the mother and daughter. Lady Catherine observed after dinner that Miss Bennet seemed out of spirits, and immediately accounting for it herself by supposing that she did not like to go home again so soon, she added, "But if that is the case, you must write to your mother to beg that you may stay a little longer. Mr. Collins will be very glad of your company, I'm sure. I'm much obliged to your ladyship for your kind invitation," replied Elizabeth, "but it is not in my power to accept it. I must be in town next Saturday. Why, at the rate you will have been more only 6 weeks. I expected you to stay 2 months. I told Mr. Collins so before you came. There can be no occasion for young so soon. Occasion for your going so soon. Mr. Bennet could certainly spare you for another fortnight, but my father cannot. He wrote last week to hurry my return. Oh, your father, of course, may spare you if your mother can. Daughters, are never of so much consequence to a father, and if you will stay another month complete, it will be in my power to take one of you as far as London, for I am going there early in June for a week, and as Dawson does not object to the brooch box, there will be very good room for one of you, and indeed, if the weather should happen to be cool, I should not object to taking you both, as you are neither of you large. You are all kindness, madam, but I believe we must abide by our original plan. Lady Catherine seemed resigned. Mr. Collins, you must send the servant with them. You know I always speak my mind, and I cannot bear the idea of two young women traveling post by themselves. It is highly improper. You must contrive to send somebody. I have the greatest dislike in the world to the sort of thing. Young women should always be properly guarded and attend according to their situation in life. When my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate last summer, I made point of her having two men servants go with her. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy, Pemberley, and Lady Anne could not have appeared with propriety in a different manner. I am excessively attentive to all those things. You must send John with the young ladies, Mr. Collins. I am glad it occurred to me to mention it, for it would really be discreditable to you to let them go alone. My uncle is to send a servant for us. Oh, your uncle, he keeps a manservant, does he? I am very glad you have somebody who thinks of those things. Where shall you change horses? Oh, Broomley, of course. If you mention my name at the bell, you will be attended to. Lady Catherine had many other questions to ask respecting their journey, and as she did not answer them all herself, attention was necessary, which Elizabeth believed to be lucky for her, or with a mind so occupied she might have forgotten where she was. Reflection must be reserved for solitary hours. Whenever she was alone, she gave way to it as the greatest relief, and not a day went by without a solitary walk in which she might indulge in all the delight of unpleasant recollections. Mr. Darcy later Mr. Darcy's letter she was in fair way of soon knowing by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings towards its writer were at times widely different. When she remembered the style of his address, she was still full of indignation, but when she considered how unjustly she had condemned and upbraided him, her anger was turned against herself, and his disappointed feelings became the object of compassion. His attachment excited gratitude, his general character respect, but she could not approve him, nor could she for a moment repent her refusal or feel the slightest inclination ever to see him again. In her own past behaviour there was a constant source of vexation and regret, and in the unhappy defects of her family a subject of yet behaviour chagrin. They were hopeless of remedy. Her father, contented with laughing at them, would never exert himself to restrain the wild uh, giddiness of his youngest daughters, and her mother, with manners so far from right herself, was entirely insensible of the evil. Elizabeth had frequently united with Jane in an endeavour to check the imprudence of Catherine and Lydia, but while they were supported by their mother's indulgence, what chance could there be of improvement? Catherine, weak spirited, irritable, and completely under Lydia's guidance, um, had been always affronted by their advice, and Lydia, self willed and careless, would scarcely give them a hearing. They were ignorant, idle, and vain. While there was an officer in Meryton, they would flirt with him, and while Meryton was within a walk of Longbourns, they would be going there forever. Anxiety on Jane's behalf was another prevailing concern, and Mr. Darcy's explanation by restoring Bingley to all her former good opinion heightened the sense of what Jane had lost. His affection was proved to have been sincere, and his conduct cleared of all blame, unless any could attach to the implicitness of his confidence in his friend. How grievous then was this thought then of a situation so desirable in every respect, so replete with advantage, so promising for happiness. Jane had been deprived by the folly and indecorum of her own family. When to these recollections was added the development of Wickham's character, it may be easily believed that the that the happy spirits, which had seldom been depressed, therefore were now so much affected as to make it almost impossible for her appear tolerably cheerful. Their engagements at Rosings were as frequent during the last week of her stay as they had been at first. The very last evenings was spent there, and her ladyship again inquired minutely into the particulars of their journey, gave them directions as to the best method of packing, and was so urgent on the necessity of placing gowns in the only right way that Maria thought herself obliged, on her return, to undo all the work of the morning and pack her trunk afresh. When they parted, Lady Catherine, with great condescension, wished them a good journey and invited them to come to Hunsford again next year, and Miss Dorbrooks exerted herself so far as to show courtesy and hold out her hand to both. Chapter 15. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins met for breakfast a few minutes before the others appeared, and he took the opportunity of paying the parting civilities which he deemed indispensably necessary. "I know not, Miss Elizabeth," said he, "whether Mr. Collins has yet expressed her sense of your kindness in coming to us, but I am very certain you will not leave the house without receiving her thanks for it. The favor of your company has been much felt, I assure you. We know how little there is to been much felt. I assure you, we know how little there is to tempt anyone to our humble abode, our plain manner of living. Our small rooms and a few domestics, and the little we see of the world must make Hansford extremely dull to a young lady like yourself. But I hope you will believe us grateful for the condescension, and we have done everything in our power to prevent you spending your time unpleasantly." Elizabeth was eager with her thanks and assurance of happiness. She had spent 6 weeks with great enjoyment, and the pleasure of being with Charlotte and the kind attentions she had received must make her feel so obliged. Mr. Collins was great and gratified, and with a more smiling solemnity replied, "It gives me the greatest pleasure to hear that you have passed your time not disagreeable. We have certainly done our best, and most fortunately, having it in our power to introduce you to very superior society, and from our connection with Rosings, the frequent means of wearing the humble home scene, I think we may flatter ourselves that your Hansford visit cannot have been entirely irksome. Our situation with regard to Lady Hasbro's family is indeed this sort of extraordinary advantage and blessing which few can boast. You see on what a footing we are. You see how continually we are engaged there. In truth, I must acknowledge that with all the disadvantages of this humble personage, I should not think anyone abiding in it an object of compassion, while they are sharers of our intimacy at Rosings. Words were insufficient for the elevation of his feelings, and he was obliged to walk about the room, while Elizabeth tried to unite civility and truth in few short sentences. "You may in fact carry a very favourable report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin. I flatter myself at least that you will be able to do so. Lady Catherine's great attentions to Mr. Collins you have been lately witness of, and altogether I trust it does not appear that your friend has grown an unfortunate, but on this point it will be as well to be silent. Only let me assure you, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that I can from my heart most cordially wish you equal felicity in marriage, my dear Charlotte, and I have but one mind and one way of thinking. There is in everything I most remarkably resemblance of character and ideas between us. We seem to have been designed for each other." Elizabeth could safely say that it was a great happiness where that was the case, and with equal sincerity could add that she firmly believed and rejoiced in his domestic comfort. She was not sorry, however, to have the recital of them interrupted by the entrance of the lady from whom they sprang. Poor Charlotte! It was melancholy to leave her to such society, but she had chosen it with her eyes open and thought, evidently regretting that her visitors were to go. She did not seem to ask for compassion. Her home and her housekeeping, her parish and her poultry had all their dependent concerns had not yet lost their charms. At length the chase arrived, the trunks were fastened on, the parcels placed within, and it was pronounced to be ready. After an affectionate parting between the friends, Elizabeth was attended to the carriage by Mr. Collins, and as they walked down the garden, he was commissioning her with his best respects to all her family, not forgetting his thanks for the kindness he had received at Longbourn in the winter, and his compliments to Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Though unknown, he then handed her in. Maria followed, and the door was on the point of being closed when he suddenly reminded them through so many concentration that they had hitherto forgotten to leave any message for the ladies of Rosings. But he added, "You will of course wish to have your humble respects delivered to them with your grateful thanks for their kindness to you while you have been here." Elizabeth made no objection. The door was then allowed to be shut, and the carriage drove off. "Good gracious!" cried Mary, after a few minutes' silence. "It seems but a day or two since we first met came, and yet how many things have happened." "A great many indeed," said her companion with a sigh. "We have dined 9 times at Rosings, besides drinking tea there twice. How much I shall have to tell!" Elizabeth privately added, "and how much I shall have to conceal." Their journey was performed without much conversation or any alarm, and within 4 hours of their leaving Hunsford they reached Mr. Gardiner's house, where they were to remain a few days. Jane looked well, and Elizabeth had little opportunity of studying her spirits amidst the various engagements which the kindness of her aunt had reserved for them. But Jane was to go to home with her, and at Longbourn there would be leisure enough for observation. It was not without an effort, meanwhile, that she could wait even for Longbourn before she told her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposals. To know that she had the power of revealing what would so exceedingly astonish Jane, and must at the time so highly gratify whatever of her own vanity she had not yet been able to reason away, was such a temptation of awkwardness as nothing could have conquered. By the state of indecision in which she remained as to the extent of what she could communicate, and her fear, if she once entered on the subject, of being hurried into repeating something of Bingley which might only grieve her sister farther. It was the second week in May in which the three young ladies set out together from Gracechurch Street for the town of in Hertfordshire, and as they drew near the appointed inn where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they quickly perceived, in tokens of coachman's punctuality, both Kitty and Lydia looking out of dining room upstairs. These two girls had been above an hour in the place, happily employed in visiting an opposite millionaire, watching the sentinel on guard, and dressing a salad and cucumber. After welcoming their sisters, they triumphantly displayed a table set out with such a cold meat as in larder usually affords, exclaiming, Is not this an agreeable surprise? And we mean to treat you all," added Lydia, "but you must lend us the money, for we have just spent hours at the shop out there showing her purchases. Look here, I have bought this bonnet. I do not think it is very pretty, but I thought I might as well buy it as not. I shall pull it to pieces as soon as I get home and see if I can make it up any better." And when her sisters abused it as ugly, she added with perfect unconcern, "Oh, but there were 2 or 3 much uglier in the shop, and when I have bought some prettier colors set in to trim it with fresh, I think it will be very tolerable. But you know how it wears this summer after the Shire have left Merton, and they are going in a fortnight. Our Brighton, and I do so to talk over the scheme, and I dare say would hardly cost anything at all. Mama would like to go to all of all things, only think what a miserable summer else we shall have. Yes, though, Elizabeth, that would be delightful scheme indeed. At once good heaven, Brighton had a whole campful of soldiers to us who have been overset already by one poor regiment of militia, and the monthly balls of merit. And now I have got some news for you. What do you think? It is excellent news, Elizabeth. It is excellent news, capital news, and about a certain person who is going to be married before me and you ovule. And Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other, and the waiter was told that he needed to not indiscretion. You say he often oh, I'm glad he's gone. I never saw that be quite an old maid. I am declare she is almost 3 and Lord, how ashamed I should be of not being married before 3 and 20. My own Phillips wants you so to get husbands. You can't think. She says Lizzie had better have taken Mr. Collins, but I do not think there would have been any fun in it. Lord, how I should like to be married before any of you, and then I would chaperone you about to all the balls, really. We had such a good piece of fun the other day at Colonel Forster's. Kitty and me were to spend the day there, and Mrs. Forster promised to have a little dance in the evening. By Mr. Forster and me are such friends, and so she asked the two Harringtons to come, but Harriet was ill, and so Pan was forced to come by herself. And then what do you think we did? We dressed up Chamberlain in woman's clothes on purpose to pass for like uh